and I think we'll make a start. So hello, and thank you for joining us to discuss the new methodology for this year's Forest 500 assessments. My name is Hannah Franklin. I'm the Corporate Performance Communications Lead at Global Canopy, and I'll be moderating today. Now in its 10th year, Forest 500 ranks the most influential financial institutions driving tropical deforestation. These financial institutions also have the power to transform global commodity supply chains. But in order for this to happen, we need transparency, and transparency is central to our mission here at Global Canopy. This is because progress can only be made if everyone shares their learnings. So we're hosting this webinar today to give you an overview of how we assess financial institutions, and then also answer any questions that you may have. We've just got a couple of housekeeping points before we start. So if you could please post your questions for our panel in the Q&A box that you'll be able to see in front of you. We'll have time for questions in the second half of the webinar. And the chat function is also open for discussion. And the webinar is being recorded, so it will be shared afterwards. So today we'll hear from Emma Thomson, head of the Forest 500, who will explain the new assessment methodology for financial institutions in the Forest 500. We'll also hear from Pei Chi Wong, Senior Research Associate at Global Canopy, who will introduce the suite of guidance that we have created for financial institutions. But before we get into the content today, we have a quick anonymous poll that we'd like you to answer, and this should be coming up on your screen now. I'll just read that out. So the poll is, what are the biggest challenges your organization is facing in achieving portfolios that are free from deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses? Are they setting clear targets to be conversion and deforestation free against best practice? Reporting on progress towards eliminating conversion and deforestation from portfolios? Is it a lack of transparency from clients or holdings in commodity supply chains on conversion and deforestation? Eliminating associated human rights abuses from portfolios? Is it a lack of data on company exposure and performance on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses? Or is it around no relevant legislation applying to the finance sector? And I'll just give you a moment to answer that. So the results are in. Take a look in a moment. And actually, we have 100% of the respondents have said it's around a lack of data on company exposure and performance. So hopefully this segues quite nicely into handing over to Pei Chi, who's going to talk to you about our guidance and tools that will help you to start on your journeys. And I'll hand over to Pei Chi now.
Thanks, Hannah. So the Deforestation-Free Finance portal can be found at guidance.globalcanopy.org, and it's a one-stop shop for guidance on how financial institutions can eliminate deforestation from your portfolios. In addition to the finance sector roadmap, which launched in 2021, we've also published detailed guidance aimed at pension schemes, family offices, and foundations, as well as how financial institutions can carry out due diligence on deforestation exposure in your portfolios. So next slide, please. The roadmap is structured in 6 phases, which do not have to be completed in linear order as shown, but as disclosure is usually the output of risk assessment, monitoring, and engagement processes. With that end in mind, I like to emphasize the importance of disclosure of the progress you have made in assessing deforestation risk in your portfolio, as well as engaging your clients and holdings and monitoring the progress that they have made or that they should be making towards deforestation-free supply chains. So disclosure provides really important data for your stakeholders, including your investors, which helps them understand how you're meeting expectations on tackling deforestation. And importantly, it also sends signals to drive industry-wide change to achieve deforestation-free portfolios and a deforestation-free economy at large. So we go on to the next slide of how that can be done. In our due diligence guidance, we set out 2 decision trees, which are designed to collect structured information about our companies, operations, and policies to assess their exposure risk, which is the probability that a commodity that they produce or source is associated with deforestation, conversion, or associated human rights abuses, and what policies and processes they have in place to address this inherent exposure risk. We then show, using a decision matrix, how these two dimensions can be combined into an overall deforestation risk flag. And we use a risk-based approach that aims to assign these risk flags based on the least granular available data. And of course, the methodology that we have described in our due diligence guidance is fully transparent and flexible. So you know everything that goes into this methodology and you can adjust it to the level of risk appetite of your respective organizations. So as an example of this risk-based approach to data collection, if you go to the next slide, please. In very clear cases where a client or holding is operating in an industry or sector that does not produce or source forest risk commodities, it can be assigned a low deforestation risk flag based on that industry classification. And the user can then focus on, other companies in higher risk industries and sectors. And the guidance also looks at whether the company has been linked to known incidents in order to assess whether or not, for example, even if a company is in a low risk sector, if they have been associated with known incidents based on databases such as rep risk and other reports from the ground, then they should also be assigned as a high risk exposure. We also guide financial institutions to look at whether companies are involved in producing or sourcing forest risk commodities in high-risk countries and regions of production, and where such granular geospatial information is available, whether they have assets or production sites in a deforestation hotspot. So all these factors are assessed as a very basic baseline of assigning the exposure risk flag. Now we go on to the next slide. In terms of a company's policies, our guidance also sets a baseline expectation that companies and supply chain actors should have policy commitments on both deforestation as well as human rights protection, as the best evidence shows that these must go hand in hand to effectively prevent deforestation and conversion. So where a company is in the Forest 500 dataset, for example, the guidance sets a threshold of 60% on the overall score, below which a high policy risk flag is defined. And that can also be adjusted by your respective organizations if you have a more stringent risk appetite. So where a company is not covered in the data set, which we know of course, identifies the most influential supply chain actors. So if you're looking at a wider investment universe, we also look at some key metrics, such as the strength of the deforestation commitment that a company has made, which of the key human rights associated with deforestation and conversion the company has committed to protect in their policies, and whether there is verified implementation reporting that they are actually adhering to these policies. So as you can see, the methodology in the due diligence guidance is very much aligned with the Forest 500 methodology. So with that, I will hand the time back to Hannah.
Thank you for that overview, Pei Chi. And now we'll hand over to Emma, who's going to talk through the Forest 500 methodology. And just a reminder as well, if you do want to post questions in the Q&A, we can answer those after Emma's session.
Great, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Pei Chi, as well. I know that some of you are already familiar with the Forest 500, but I just wanted to take a few minutes to give a quick introduction or reintroduction to what Forest 500 is and how our assessment process works. If I could have the next slide, please. In 2014, Forest 500 was developed to hold companies and financial institutions accountable to the deforestation commitments that they were making as part of initiatives like the New York Declaration on Forests and the Consumer Goods Forum. Although those original commitments for the 2020 target date were missed, Forest 500 has continued to assess the companies and financial institutions on the strength and implementation of their approach on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. These Forest 500 assessments are done once a year using only publicly available information, so anything that's published on the web domains of the companies and financial institutions that we assess. And these assessments are then published on our website, which is forest500.org, which you can see on the screen currently, in the first quarter of each year. But before we can complete the assessments, we first identify which are the 350 companies and 150 financial institutions which have the greatest influence on tropical deforestation through their supply chains and financing activities. Next slide, please. To identify these 500 companies and institutions, every 2 years, we first identify the countries which are producing the greatest volume of beef, palm oil, soy, pulp and paper, timber, and leather, and which also have the greatest amount of forest loss. Then we identify which countries are importing and exporting the greatest value of each of those commodities in their various forms. And then these countries, which collectively this year or in 2022 was around 50 countries, are then used as a guide to inform our selection of the companies. To select the companies, we use a variety of data and metrics to identify which companies have the highest exposure to deforestation risk based on the volumes of each of the 6 highest forest risk commodities they are producing or using. So again, that's beef, palm oil, soy, paper, timber, and leather. Next slide, please. We select companies that are throughout the forest risk supply chains, so across all stages, and we group those into 5 categories. So as you can see on the screen, we have producers, processors, traders, manufacturers, and retailers. We select a roughly even number of companies at each of those supply chain stages and across each of the 6 commodities that we focus on. Next slide, please. Once the companies have been selected, which as I mentioned happens every 2 years, we then identify which 150 financial institutions are providing the greatest amount of finance to those 350 companies through shareholdings, loans and underwritings, and bond holdings. These financial institutions are then assessed once for each of the 4 commodities, so palm oil, soy, timber products, which includes both timber and pulp and paper, and cattle products, which includes both beef and leather. Next slide, please. Now that we know how companies and financial institutions were selected to be included in the Forest 500, let's move on to what will the Forest 500 financial institutions be assessed on this year. The next slide, please. As you will all have been notified by email about a week and a half ago now, the 2023 Financial Institution Assessment period started on the 22nd of May and is expected to run until the 31st of August of this year. Any information which is publicly available during that assessment period will be considered in your 2023 assessment. So anything available on your website, from a policy document to an annual report to a press release, will be reviewed and considered as part of that 2023 assessment. All 150 institutions will be assessed on the strength and implementation of their commitments on deforestation and associated human rights that are applied to their financial portfolios. So looking at things like, do they have a strong deforestation policy with an ambitious target date, through to, are they publishing evidence of the implementation of their labour rights commitment? These assessments will be done against the best practice for financial institutions in forest risk commodity supply chains. And to do that, our methodology is aligned with the finance sector roadmap that Pei Chi touched on earlier, which is also aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative. Once these assessments have been completed, they will then be published on forest500.org in early 2024, where they will be publicly accessible in line with the 10th Forest 500 launch. The next slide, please. We have made some changes to the assessment process this year, which we wanted to tell you about. For the first time this year, financial institutions that are assessed in the Forest 500 will be able to view their completed assessment before it is made publicly available in early 2024. The completed assessment will be able to be viewed on a platform where financial institutions can provide feedback if needed, provided that any documents or information shared is accessible on publicly available links that were available during the 2023 assessment period. The window within which financial institutions will be able to view their assessment is, as you can see on the screen, from the 19th of September to the 3rd of October, 2023. This 2-week window is the only time in which financial institutions can view their assessment in advance of the public launch, and any feedback given after the end of that period, so after the 3rd of October, will not be considered. You will receive more information about this closer to the time, including how you can access that completed assessment. But as noted in our email, please do make sure that either yourself or a relevant staff member is available to view the completed assessment during this time if you would like to view it in advance. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I now wanted to take you through some of the key changes to the methodology from this year. The full detail of what's changed and how it's changed will be available in our full methodology document, which will be available on our website by the end of today. But I did just want to give a quick overview. The next slide, please. As in previous years, our methodology continues to be broken down into 4 main sections. So we have the overall approach, which looks for a financial institution's high-level approach on deforestation. So things such as, are they members of relevant initiatives or signatories to initiatives that focus on deforestation? Or are they involved in legislative advocacy linked to deforestation? We then have policy strength, which looks at the strength and scope of policies on deforestation and traceability. We then have associated human rights, where we assess the strength of policies on the human rights abuses that are most frequently associated with deforestation, including free, prior and informed consent and customary rights to land, resources and territory. And then finally, we have implementation and reporting, which looks at how the financial institution is implementing their commitments and transparently reporting on their progress towards those commitments. One of the changes this year to our scoring was to increase the weighting of the implementation and reporting section of a financial institution's total score. So that section is now worth 50% of a financial institution's score from our 2023 assessments. We have also added one new indicator this year, which is looking at whether financial institutions are reporting on the implementation of their human rights commitments. More detail on that indicator will be available in our methodology document, which we will share with you directly via email with the link to this recording and also the methodology document itself. The next slide, please. Next slide, please. I think skip 3. And one more. Thank you very much. So now I just wanted to take you through some of the most frequently asked questions that we have about our methodology. So if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the common questions we get is, have the organizations identified been directly linked to causing deforestation? And the answer is no. The companies and financial institutions included in the Forest 500 have a significant influence over the production and processing of the commodities that drive the most deforestation through their supply chains or financing activities. Through those activities, these companies and institutions are at significant risk of driving deforestation and the human rights abuses that are associated with them. These 500 companies and institutions need to set and implement commitments to prevent that from happening. And if all 500 companies and institutions we assessed took strong and effective action on deforestation, it would have the power to transform global supply chains of forest risk commodities. The next slide, please. So for the commodities that we look at, the 6 commodities that drive over 2/3 of tropical deforestation are palm oil, soy, beef, leather, timber, and pulp and paper, which, as we mentioned earlier, for financial institutions is assessed for palm oil, for soy, for timber products, so grouping pulp and paper and timber, and then cattle products, so grouping beef and leather together. We may consider adding other commodities in future years. It is something that we review as part of our methodology review and our selection process every 2 years. But at the moment, those 6 commodities are still driving over 2/3 of deforestation. Next slide, please. What is a Forest 500 power broker? So a power broker is a word that we use to define all of the companies and financial institutions that are in the Forest 500. And it is those that have the greatest influence on tropical deforestation through their production, use, or financing of forest risk commodities. Companies are selected as power brokers based on their exposure to those commodities, which is identified using a variety of metrics. So often companies will be a power broker for between 1 and 6 commodities, but then they're also assessed for any of the other commodities we look at that they also have some exposure to. Financial institutions are classified as power brokers for the 4 commodity groups: palm oil, soy, timber products, and cattle products. And that power broker status is determined through their financing of the companies that we've identified. Next slide, please. The Forest 500 methodology is based on some well-established best practice. So we have been assessing companies and financial institutions since 2014, and we do review our methodology annually to ensure that it remains aligned with best practice. In 2022, we aligned our methodology with the finance sector roadmap, which is also aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative, which is the Accountability Framework Initiative defines the best practice for companies in forest risk supply chains, and the finance sector roadmap and our methodology translates that to what do financial institutions need to do to align with best practice for the financial institutions, but also ensure that they're requiring companies to act in line with best practice too. We do continue to annually review our methodology, which led to some of the changes that I mentioned earlier. Next slide, please. Forest 500 does only consider publicly available information within our assessments. So that is anything that is publicly available on your web domains within our assessment period. And the reason that we do this is because there needs to be greater transparency from companies and financial institutions if we are to effectively eliminate deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. With incoming legislation, it's already requiring greater transparency for companies. And some of that legislation looks likely to be soon applied to financial institutions too, when those legislations are reviewed in the coming years. But transparency also enables collaboration between financial institutions to, for instance, with collaborative engagement. We've seen a lot of examples of that in the last year or two. And it also advances in shared understanding of challenges and progress, but it can also lead to accountability and encouraging other financial institutions to act and improve to correspond to what other financial institutions are doing who are making more progress. Next slide, please. Can organizations input into the assessments? So no, the Forest 500 assessments will continue to be completed independently within that assessment period. As I mentioned earlier, this year we have introduced a new window within which financial institutions can view their completed assessment, which again is from the 19th of September to the 3rd of October, 2023. If those financial institutions do have any feedback, then that can be provided within that window. But again, that must be publicly available in the assessment period. And that assessment will be published in early 2024. Next slide, please. One question we frequently get is, are organizations assessed in their native language? So all financial institutions and companies that we assess are assessed in English, but they are also assessed in the native language of the country where they are headquartered. So for instance, this year, some examples would include German, Japanese, Mandarin, and Spanish are all languages we will be assessing financial institutions in. The next slide, please. I also wanted to touch on how do score bands work. So on our website, forest500.org, on our rankings page, next to every financial institution's name that we assess, there are 5 dots, some of which are filled and some of which are not. So as I touched on earlier, financial institutions are given scores out of 100, and these are then translated into a score band out of 5. So a score of 0% is equivalent to 0 out of 5. So that would be not scoring for any of the indicators in our methodology. Scoring 1 to 19% is equivalent to 1 out of 5, 20 to 39% equivalent to 2 out of 5, and so forth, until finally a score of 80 to 100% is then equivalent to a score of 5 out of 5. The next slide, please. And in addition to putting any questions in the Q&A box, which please do if you have any, you can also email us with any specific questions on your assessment or any more detail on our methodologies in general at forest500@globalcanopy.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. So we're now going to open up some of your questions. So thanks for sending those through. And please do continue to use the Q&A box to send through more questions and hopefully get through as many as we can. So the first question is, what advice would you give a financial institution that has not yet started to look at deforestation? Where should they begin? Maybe Pei Chi, if you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the really important step, I think, is to be able to understand and map the risk that's in your portfolio. So I think in practice, as I mentioned, the steps, the phases in the roadmap don't have to be completed in linear order, but we do find that in practice, in order for a financial institution to be able to set an effective policy, actually understanding the kind of exposure they have, the profile of the companies in terms of the specific context of the commodities and the countries and regions of production that they might be exposed to. It's really important to have that at least high-level view before you go into the details of being able to set the policy, because for most organizations to be able to set a policy, you would also want to know that the policy you set, you do have the capacity and resources to be able to implement and adhere to that policy. So I think being able to understand, the general context of deforestation risk and also the specificities of, the client base of the investment holdings that you have in your portfolio, that's very important. And to be able to do that, there are numerous data tools and metrics that you can look at. So for example, actually, although Forest 500 is also a tracking tool, it also can function as a data source for you to be able to assess the most influential companies within supply chains. So you can go into the company scoring and ranking to look at some of the major companies and how they perform in terms of their policy setting and implementation. So that's one first step. You can also refer to other data sets such as key ones would be ZSL Spot and CDP Forest are some of the commonly used ones. Trace and Trace Finance also have really good granular data about traders in specific commodity and country contexts. So really, I would say the first cut is to look at the clients and investment holdings in your portfolio and compare that against some of the quite detailed data sets that are already out there that have already identified the most exposed companies and what commodities they are associated with.
Thanks, Pei Chi. Hopefully that gives people a good initial steer. This next one's also probably for you, Pei Chi. We've got a question. What does a good deforestation policy look like?
Yeah, thanks for that. So if anyone would like to refer to the really detailed guidance in our finance sector roadmap, we do have quite a few pages that go through what a strong policy looks like. But I would say, just to distill down the key elements, it's really specificity and level of ambition. You would want to set a commitment and a target that is really commensurate with the scale of the problem and the urgency of the problem. So the UN recommends that 2025 should be the timeline by which we eliminate deforestation from supply chains. But of course, there's also, if you are at different steps of the journey, the roadmap does, provide guidance as to what kind of timelines are reasonable to be set from the beginning of the journey. Second of all, so that brings me to the second element, which is really important, which is having time-bound action plans. So you would want to be able to set a time by which you commit to eliminate deforestation, and also have milestones in between to say when you would have completed your initial assessment, when you would start to engage with your clients and holdings, what timeline you expect them to have in order to make progress. And that's really having a time-bound commitment is also part of the ambition of it. And I think the third element that's really important is also having that transparency. So being able to disclose your commitments, disclose the timeline and the concrete mechanisms that you intend to implement to operationalize those commitments. It's very important because it sends a signal to the industry. It sends a signal to your client base and investment universe as to what baseline expectations you'll be setting and what they can expect from you in terms of engagement. And that also, helps your efforts and the resources that you have invested in this process to be readily recognized by tracking and accountability processes.
Thanks, Pei Chi. This next one's probably for you, Emma. Why don't you assess other commodities, including cocoa and coffee?
So this is a question we get quite frequently. In some specific regions and countries, cocoa and coffee are the biggest drivers of deforestation. And that's similar for other commodities and other drivers of deforestation as well. But just like the Forest 500, we look across tropical forests in general and across tropical forests globally, the 6 commodities we focus on, so palm oil, soy, beef, leather, timber, and pulp and paper, are still the 6 commodities that collectively are driving the most deforestation. So that is something that we do review biannually in line with our selection processes, and especially with the recent EU due diligence legislation and the scope of that legislation, we will be reviewing that again this year in 2024 when we do our next round of selection.
The next question is also probably for you, Emma. So are the policies that we have for our own operations and not our financing included in the assessment?
So our assessment does focus solely on the commitments and policies that financial institutions have in place for their financing activities. So we do recognise that there are lots of financial institutions that have strong policies for their own sourcing of, say, paper, for example, is a common one that we see in our assessments, but unfortunately that doesn't score any points in our methodology. So it is exclusively policies, processes, and reporting that apply to policies for the financing activities.
And how can we access more detail about their methodology?
We will be publishing our full methodology later on today on our website at forest500.org. But you will all be sent a link to the methodology document alongside a recording of this webinar. And in that document, we go into a lot more detail than I have today. So it goes through every indicator by name, in addition to the guidance that the assessors use to score every financial institution, the applicable answer options, and also any essential details that we collect as we're also doing the assessment. So that will all be in there, in addition to the number of points that each indicator is worth in a financial institution's total score.
Just got a couple more questions. So please do keep them coming. We do still have 10 minutes left for you to ask away. Are all types of financial institutions assessed in the same way?
Broadly, yes. So our methodology, when it was aligned, especially since being aligned with the finance sector roadmap, but since its kind of inception, was designed to be applicable to all types of financial institution. So we do know that different types of financial institutions have slightly different relationships to deforestation and to potentially the clients or holdings that are connected to deforestation or could be connected to deforestation. But our methodology has been designed to apply to all types of financial institutions, and kind of recognizing that there are those different relationships which are factored into the assessment process. The only exception to that would be in one of our final scope indicators. So for every indicator on policy strength and associated human rights abuses, we also assess the scope of that commitment. And one of those indicators is looking at whether that policy applies to all clients or holdings throughout each of the stages of the supply chain. And for some financial institutions, that does explicitly include, does that apply to other financial institutions that could be being financed?
Just another question come through as well. So you said that the weighting of implementation and reporting have increased. Is the weighting even more important for these indicators in the 2024 assessment than it was in the 2023 assessment?
So our 2023 assessment is just starting now. So although we launched the data early in 2024, it is still the 2023 assessment, but in reporting and implementation is worth more of a financial institution's total score this year than in the latest round of data that we launched in in February. So yes, this year reporting implementation is worth 50% of the financial institution's total score, which has increased from, I think it was 44% last year.
And this looks to be our final question. Have there been any changes to the company methodology this year?
Yes, there have. So as Pei Chi mentioned, the Forest 500 can also be used by financial institutions to understand their exposure to deforestation risk and to clients or holdings that are those with the highest influence on deforestation. So we have made some changes to our methodology for companies this year. Again, the full detailed methodology is published for the companies on our website. So that is there for you to access if you would like. But again, the biggest trend or biggest change would be increasing the proportion of a company score that is from implementation and reporting. So for companies, that's now 60, I think it's almost 2/3 of their total score is now made up for implementation and reporting.
Thanks, Emma. Well, it looks like we don't have any more questions. So I wanted to thank you for joining our presentation or our webinar today, and thank Emma and Pei Chi for their presentations. A recording will be shared with you soon, and that will include links to the methodology. And lastly, we would be really grateful if you can complete a short survey at the end of this webinar, and it should appear in the web browser now. So thanks very much for everyone, and I hope that you have a nice day.